Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here for CCST's expert briefing on data security in precision agriculture. My name is Brie Lindsey. I'm the Director of Science Services at the California Council on Science and Technology, and I'd like to open our briefing today by acknowledging that I'm presenting to you from Sacramento, California, the tribal land of the Nisenan people. Sacramento has been a gathering place for many local tribes. We acknowledge the Southern Maidu people to the north, the Valley and Plains Miwok peoples to the south of the American River, and the Patwin Wintun peoples to the west of the Sacramento River. Today, I'll introduce CCST, our Disaster Resilience Initiative, and then hand it over to our moderator and expert panelists. The California Council on Science and Technology is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that was established over 30 years ago at the request of the legislature. CCST was created to provide science and technology advice to from the wealth of outstanding academic and research institutions in our state directly to policymakers. California is lucky to have such an incredible network of expertise, and our job here at CCST is to help amplify and translate the expertise in this network into actionable advice for policymakers. We do this through a number of mechanisms, including briefings like the one you're attending today, workshops, peer-reviewed reports, and the CCST Science Fellows Program, where we place PhD scientists and engineers for a year of government service and leadership training in the executive branch and the legislature. As part of our mission, CCST is advancing work related to our Disaster Resilience Initiative to help the state better prepare for and respond to ongoing, complex, and intersecting disasters that affect public health, our economy, and our environment. These include climate change, power outages, the COVID-19 pandemic, and cybersecurity threats against critical infrastructure, which can radically disrupt the ways in which Californians live and work. These disruptions can be destructive and painful, but they can also provide us opportunities to redesign our systems to be more resilient and sustainable. Through our Disaster Resilience Initiative, we seek to deliver science and technology advice to reduce harm and improve the lives of all Californians. Today, we're focusing on the susceptibility of data systems in using precision agriculture and technology. I'm very pleased now to be able to introduce our moderator, Dr. Pramod Khargonekar, who is Vice Chancellor for Research and Distinguished Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at the University of California, Irvine. He has over 4 decades of experience as an educator, scholar, and leader in science and technology. At the NSF, he helped create a new framing for multidisciplinary research that led to emerging topics such as the food-water-energy nexus and resilient infrastructure systems and process. He continues to be a leader in science and technology, including as a member of CCST's Board of Directors and as a scientific advisory board member for the NSF Engineering Research Center, Internet of Things for Precision Agriculture. Welcome, Pramod, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Brie, and good day, everyone. We're glad to have you in this webinar. Cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, including food and agriculture systems, are on the rise across the nation and have the potential to affect local communities, private companies, and the global economy. In 2021, the FBI identified 5 large cyber attacks on food supply systems. These events affect large, well-known companies and small farming co-ops with ransoms ranging from 6 million to 40 million. By its very nature, precision agriculture and associated hardware and software systems generate large amounts of data that are extremely valuable to farmers, private industry, and public agencies. They offer important targets for hackers. Corruption, loss, or disruption to these data can have large downstream impact on farm operations, crop yields, and food supply chains and availability. They have the potential to seriously impact economies and jobs. In a time when data privacy, security, and rights are being debated, agricultural and food systems represent a major sector of California that deserves much greater attention. There are still many unanswered questions regarding data generation and ownership and security. We are delighted that we have 4 outstanding panelists with us today who will discuss the advantages that precision agriculture offers, the infrastructure required to support precision agriculture, and the vulnerabilities of the data generated by the system to misuses and theft. At this point, I'm going to welcome our panelists and ask them to introduce themselves. Let's start with Alireza Pourreza.
Thank you very much for your introduction. My name is Alireza Pourreza. I am an assistant professor at UC Davis and the director of the Digital Agriculture Lab here. And I use this opportunity to give an overview of what we are doing in my lab. So most of us know that today we can only regenerate half of the natural resources that we consume every year. Before 1970, we used to be able to regenerate 100% of it. This is a very concerning issue, and we must find solutions to stop and reverse this trend. Well, regenerative agriculture is a key player in this effort, and technologies such as remote sensing, AI, 5G, and cloud computing are instrumental tools that we need for practicing a sustainable crop production. In Digital Agriculture Lab, my team focuses on agricultural data interpretation and developing decision support tools for growers that enable them to improve efficiency in the use of inputs such as water, nutrition, chemicals, and labor, and to increase yield, still maintaining the quality of the environment. Of course, when we integrate data and AI and connectivity to any industry, there is always the threat of data security in various forms, such as identity theft, losing of confidential data, loss of reputation, or disruption to the food supply chain. And it's really important that we are prepared before we move to this new revolution in agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you, Alireza, and welcome. Next, I want to introduce Chandra Krintz from UC Santa Barbara. Chandra?
Thank you, Pramod. My name is Chandra Krintz. I'm a professor of computer science at UC Santa Barbara, and my team works on intelligent infrastructure for agriculture. These are the computer systems that collect and analyze the farm records and the data from sensors, and run the applications and tools that Alireza just mentioned, the tools that he works on and just discussed. And these tools are what drives decision support and automation of farm operations. Our approach is unique in that the software we develop at UC Santa Barbara is free and open source, available to all others and easily extendable by others. This is key, we believe, in the future of precision agriculture. It's also unique in that it runs on farm, regardless of whether the farm has internet connectivity or even cellular service. And also, it's intelligent enough to operate autonomously. If we can make self-driving cars, we can make self-driving computers that work on farms, so you don't need an IT infrastructure, an IT staff. And finally, it integrates the security and privacy mechanisms from the foundation, from the beginning, the grassroots of the computer systems, so that they're built in and easily updated and accessible, so that farmers can control the sharing of their data and the security and privacy of the data they collect, because data is a key part of their economic advantage. I'll stop there.
Welcome, Chandra. And let's now invite Tiffany Drape from Virginia Tech. Tiffany.
Good morning or good afternoon, wherever we are. My name is Tiffany Drape. I'm an assistant professor at Virginia Tech here at main campus in Blacksburg, Virginia. I work in the Department of Agricultural Leadership and Community Education. And much like many of my peers, I'm passionate about the issues our food systems facing, but I look at it from a human standpoint of social science research. We look at working with producers and other partners out in the field, and then also think about how we can train not just for the future workforce, but the force that's out there right now to build and be more intuitive when they're thinking about their data and their precision agriculture techniques they implement every day. I always like to share with people my own family. I'm from a 500-acre dairy farm in upstate New York, and I cannot get my parents to put a Wi-Fi password on their router. And while it's a little bit funny, it's also a very serious thing because they run all the data from their farm through that router. And one day the kids who live across the street from the dairy ran out of ink in their printer and printed on my mom's wireless printer because it had no password, and then came over to get their school assignments laughing because they were able to use her printer. And so while very benign and definitely a little bit funny, something that they should think a little bit harder about because it's innocent, but also could be in the wrong hands of a threat or a bad actor, very serious.
Tiffany, welcome, and thanks for that wonderful anecdote. There are a lot of lessons in there. Finally, Lisa Yeo from UC Merced. Lisa?
Hello, thank you. So I'm Lisa Yeo. I'm an assistant professor at UC Merced, which is situated on land first inhabited by the Yokuts and Miwok peoples. I'm in the School of Engineering's Management of Complex Systems department, and I'm typically an information systems and operations management scholar. My focus is usually on using information systems and technology to address sort of social and organizational or business problems, and especially to look at how our ITIS solutions create new problems of their own around sort of information security and data privacy, and of course, just general usability, how people are interacting with them. I have a background in information in systems administration. I worked 15 years in private industry doing systems administration and information security. And in that, I really developed an interest in how people use and interact with the technology. So it's less about the building of tools and more about how people are using them and able to use them in ways that are productive and not harmful, as it were, even when they make mistakes, that they fail safe. And this is all to build really what I would like to see a safer and more inclusive environment for using and developing technologies. I am a member of the IoT for Ag NSF Engineering Research Center, and I'm one of 2 social scientists who are studying really the impacts of digital agriculture and these IoT tools and Internet of Things tools on sort of growers and on the operations. So things like adoption patterns, risk, value of the data that's being connected, and how folks are thinking about that. So thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
Welcome, Lisa. Okay, so we are all here. Let's kick it off. Ali, you get the first question. Can you describe what precision agriculture is and the difference between precision agriculture and digital agriculture?
Of course. So the concept of precision agriculture had been around, and it was a matter of speculation how to define this technology until 2018 that all experts in precision agriculture in Montreal, Canada gathered to define the precision agriculture, and this is how they defined it. Precision agriculture is a management strategy that gathers, processes, and analyzes temporal, spatial, and individual data and combines it with other information to support management decisions according to estimated variability for improved resource use efficiency, for productivity, quality, profitability, and sustainability of agricultural production. So precision agriculture focuses more on farm optimization and managing crops in a site-specific manner. For example, instead of applying a uniform rate of fertilizer in a precision agriculture practice, a variable rate is applied based on plant need. So that means instead of satisfying the hungriest plants in the field and apply extra nutrition to the plant that they don't need, we first of all need to understand the need of plants, and then we should have machinery and technology that can apply on a variable rate manner. As I said, it's a 25-year-old technology. Started with the availability of GPS to public in 1990 and integration of GPS in tractors for yield forecasting for soil sensing and also for variable rate application technology. Digital agriculture, on the other hand, is a newer concept. It concentrates more on extracting practical information from raw data using artificial intelligence and developing data-driven decision-making practice. So the focus on digital agriculture is more on data, on interpretation, models, and on connectivity. So that's how it's a little bit different than precision agriculture. And usually these concepts of precision agriculture, smart farming, and digital agriculture are used interchangeably. So, but they are all focusing on the same concept of food production optimization.
Thank you. And before I ask the next question, I want to encourage the audience to submit your questions through the Q&A box. Okay, let's move on. And this goes to either you or to Chandra. What are the kinds of data that are collected and how are they used to make precision agriculture work? Chandra, you want to take a crack at that one?
Sure. So a lot of the data that Alireza was mentioning there comes from sensors that are actually on the farm, in the ground, on the tractor, a part of the irrigation system. There actually could be farm records that are collected by hand. It's really a vast diversity of information about the farm. There's also remote information, so information from images from satellites. A lot of satellite data can be brought to bear on some of these decisions that farmers are making. And so that's all combined into these data sets that then we can extract actionable insights from and make decisions from, or to help farmers make decisions from.
Yeah, and to add to that,
go ahead.
I can categorize the type of data in optical sensing from remote platforms, as Chandra said, and also different type of soil sensor that are buried in the field and are connected through a network for soil moisture or monitoring soil electrical conductivity, sensors that are mounted on plants and are connected. But from the remote sensing aspect, I can categorize that to two major categories of technologies that are developed to investigate plant spectral characteristic and plant structural characteristic. And we have a lot of different sensors, hyperspectral, multispectral, and LiDAR that can measure very accurate and precise information on a per plant basis and generate a plant health status or plant nutrition status or plant yield status variability map. That is the first step in practicing precision agriculture.
Thank you. This goes to either Chandra or to Tiffany. Tiffany kind of shared a personal anecdote about her parents. But the question that it raises is, what are the ways that producers or farmers' data can be stolen or ransomed? What are risks or vulnerabilities to be aware of?
I'll start, and then certainly we'll leave time. So yes, it is funny and fun to share that because it's very real, and maybe people on the call are like, yep, I see that. So a small producer, as a good example, may not have so much vulnerability on their farm or on their land when they're immediately working it, but we can think bigger. Once that product, whatever that product is, whether it be dairy, beef, nuts, commodity crops, you pick it. Once it starts getting aggregated into the larger truckload, shipment, whatever it is, those cattle go to get processed. Again, you can think about as it gets a bigger sample, that's when you can start to see where some cracks or some holes could form. And then a bad actor could definitely take that into account. A good example is we have a lot of ground nuts that want to be imported into our country. Yes, I know California produces a lot of almonds, among other things, But if a bad actor got a hold of the data on those nuts at port when they come in on big tankers, he or she or they, whoever it is, could actually go into the system that says, yes, all of these failed. Maybe they used too many pesticides as an example, and go in and change that and say, nope, they passed. And so then all of a sudden you have tons of nuts in this example hitting the markets, going to processors who are under the assumption that they're safe. And all of a sudden they end up in thousands or tens of thousands of tiny jars, packages, and bags being sent to fill in the blank of your favorite grocery store, wherever you get your food source from. And so that's another nice example where we can start seeing that these holes may not be so important at a very small level, but when we start putting thousands of acres or thousands of hectares together, that's when they become a lot more enticing. And we saw that with the JBS pack most recently with that large scale data breach.
And I'll give a little perspective of that from the smaller holder all the way up, because there's still lots of vulnerabilities, even for small farmers or even backyard gardeners who are using data. Anytime you have a small computer or sensor that is collecting information or using a network, a communication mechanism, that mechanism can be listened to by others if it's not protected. We've heard all kinds of stories like the Ring doorbells or a child monitor, where hackers can get into these devices and view the data and manipulate that device. That all can still happen for these pieces of equipment and these farm implements and these devices that are on farm. And so it's the vulnerabilities come from the software primarily. Some hardware exploits can be taken advantage of, but the software, if it's weak or it hasn't been updated, that can lead to these vulnerabilities that expose the farmers' data. The other thing I'd like to mention is sometimes in order to use a service, say in the cloud, a farmer is required to give up ownership of her data when she does that. So it's really important to understand the requirements of the vendors that the farmer is working with, and to understand what the expectations are of how that data is going to be shared, and so that the farmer can make a really informed decision about when to share and how to share and what prevention mechanisms to consider. So it's a wide range of vulnerabilities, but also something that we really understand in the computer industry. We've made lots of improvements and inroads in the last decades, and we need to bring those improvements to the farm, to the agriculture, food processing pipeline, so that they can take advantage of these recent advantages and make sure that the data is private and secure.
Thank you both. The next, I want to go in the direction of ransomware. I mean, we have all seen these big news headlines on ransomware, including the University of California. Lisa, maybe if you want to take this one, or anybody else, are there good estimates about how a ransomware attack on a farm or co-op affects food supply chains, agricultural labor, or food prices? I mean, what do we know about ransomware attacks on this whole system?
So I'm not aware of any sort of specific research in this area, and I think when you look at it, it's going to depend on the timing and where in the chain that it happened. So much in the way that, there was the ransomware attack against a gas distribution line on the East Coast a few years ago, and that took down, the entire East Coast because it was in the right place. Right? At a gas station, it wouldn't matter, but because it was within the pipeline. And I think much like Tiffany said, it's not necessarily at the small farm where ransomware is going to have an immediate impact on our food supply, because there's still a farmer there who can still do the work. And a lot of it is, based on personal knowledge and not just on the information systems to tell them what to do. But if you then start scaling up to other places in the food supply chain and in the production process, then we start to see challenges. If I don't have access to my data and I don't know where the goods came from, or I don't know where to send my, my trucks to collect or to transport something, that's when we start to get into challenges, especially maybe you're at harvest and things are going to go bad if we don't get it out quickly. And it means that we really have to, as we know, think about our food supply and how precision ag and digital ag are really critical infrastructure and need to be protected in much the same way as other critical infrastructure that we think about.
Anybody else wants to address this question?
Yeah. Lisa makes a great point on it's hard to monetize among smaller producers, but just also keep in mind that they've also run on much tighter margins. They don't have a financial safety net. And again, we see this with natural disasters, which are not ransomware. But again, a crop ruined is a crop ruined, the end. It doesn't matter how it gets, compromised, whether it's the weather or a bad actor. And so, there's something like, I think, about 200 ransomware attacks in the United States alone, just from like the beginning of this calendar year to about now. And so again, you can think even if a third of those are in agriculture, the FBI is set up, they have a cyber division of their agency. And so when an agriculturalist gets hacked or finds themselves in compromising position, most of them don't even know that that's actually their first point of contact. The other thing is we have insurance for natural disasters. Again, no matter your commodity, no matter the genetics on your GMO seeds, but ransomware doesn't always fall in those. So if you experience a financial loss of that commodity, it's not always necessarily covered. And so that's where things like this are important to then also push insurance agencies and other kinds of agencies. Chandra mentioned who owns data when we sign off on buying that brown midrib corn seed every spring. We need to make sure our producers are asking those questions, getting that coverage, at least asking so they can find out to protect themselves too.
Those are just great insights, and strikes me that we need to think about the entire system and vulnerabilities of the system as a whole to understand where the biggest risks might lie. And clearly more research, more thinking is necessary in the agriculture, food supply, the total system from the farm to our pantries, in our houses, right? So we need to be thinking about where the points of vulnerability are, where a ransomware attack could be, like Lisa mentioned about the gas system on the East Coast. Oh, we are beginning to get audience questions, which is very exciting. So audience is getting engaged in our discussion. So I'm going to ask a question posed by audience member Lyndon Price. What agricultural data considerations should be incorporated into general data security? Who wants to take that one?
I can start out. So
yeah.
It's you can think of a farm or an agriculture facility having data hygiene, right? You want to think about where your data is, where it's stored. You want to make sure that the devices that you're using are updated. Hopefully that's happening continuously. And you also want to make sure that you're not using very old technology. Technology has to evolve, and we need to make sure it has the state-of-the-art considerations. But you got to think of it in the beginning. I think that's key. Is how am I going to keep my data secure? How am I going to manage sharing and control of my data? Which data is high priority to avoid sharing, separated from the time series weather data of your property? Really understanding and prioritizing will help dial in what security mechanisms are needed and what privacy solutions should be considered.
Anybody else want to talk? Yeah, go ahead. Lisa.
Sorry, and I wanted to think a little bit in terms of things that are kind of aligned with general issues. So in the IoT, Internet of Things space, we have seen a lot of small devices that have sort of poor design, default passwords, no passwords, difficulty changing them, and they've been used in attacks elsewhere. And I think this is the same thing that we're seeing on farms. We have this general habit of, as engineers, solving problems and trying to create something that solves a particular problem, and then not thinking necessarily in the whole systems perspective of what does it introduce. And so in as much as we are creating agricultural Internet of Things devices, from sensors to tractors that are connected, we have to think about the best practices of designing with security in mind, and that that goes both ways. To the general security practices, we should do that in general, and we should also very much do that in places where we have critical infrastructure.
I'd like to add just one other thing, and maybe Lisa or Tiffany can speak to this, is that a unique thing about farms is that just the sheer number of different individuals with all kinds of different backgrounds that are using this data and need access to it, are producing it. And we really need to think holistically about the user community, I believe, on these farms. I think that makes it a little bit different than some of these other industrial applications of IoT. And maybe you can say about some of the work that you guys have done, because I think it's really interesting and important here.
I was going to let Tiffany take that one, but I do, and this is true, and because I do think of end users just generally in all of my work and my experience, not just in agriculture, it is this, a typical user wants to use the tools to solve the problem they have, and they don't want to become experts in how all the pieces come together and work. And that then becomes really something that those of us, in research and in industry who are designing these tools need to be thinking about how to make it easy for them to do their jobs in a safe and secure way. And it's a very complex activity. There's a lot of interactive moving parts. And I'm glad when people are doing it, but we still need more effort in that space.
Thank you.
She said IoT, Lisa. So I I was like, I defer to you. Just trying to be a polite Zoomer. We here at Virginia Tech looked at some smallholder producers in terms of small grains, corn, and soybeans. So to kind of give you an idea, again, we grow a lot of it too, like a lot of states. And it was interesting, the feedback that we received off of our instrument. The producers that did respond said, we know this is going to be a bigger issue. So we need to be taught, and we're okay to, please, right? Virginia Tech, the institution, send out the stuff. We prefer it on email, which again, fine, listservs, things that they would consume on social media. But what was interesting about this, but also not surprising, was one of the questions was, who should be responsible if there's a breach or an attack, or again, food or, our commodities become compromised. A lot of the bulk of the recipients, and I can't recall the exact statistic, like we don't want any more government in our, in our pocket, but they're probably the only ones who have the enough infrastructure to help us, with this if something happens. And so it was one of those, like, we know that blessing and a curse kind of mentality. And so they knew that they were kind of stuck. They had to depend on it because none of them were even aware of things like their insurance and other, protections we have in place would be able to cover a digital, attack, some kind of digital loss. And so when I work with stakeholders and even students, because we're trying to train them for these careers, they're so great at their content. They're experts in agriculture. They're experts in their commodity, which we appreciate and respect, but they do know in the back of their minds that they need small consumable bites to start with, even if it is going back to my mom putting a Wi-Fi password on the router. And in rural America, which is where a lot of our products are grown, not all, but even things like, how do we even guarantee access? How can we ask them to do things like be more robust when a lot of them are using dial-up and DSL still, if it's even that capable? When I go to New York, I can't use Zoom. It will not connect just because we don't have the infrastructure. So is it really a fair ask for my family to be more robust when accessing it would be almost impossible because the bandwidth wouldn't be there to move data? So it's a systems issue for sure.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Gabriel Yutzi, who is the Chief Innovation Officer for University of California Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources. It's great to have him on in this audience. He asks, is it common practice to harden devices for secure data transmission and storage in university R&D and industry product development processes? For example, sensors, drones, robots. He says he hasn't seen a strong focus on this yet compared with other industries such as healthcare. Anybody wants to address this idea of hardening of devices?
I'll take that. So Hi, Gabe. It's nice to hear from you. Thank you for the question. There hasn't been a lot of work on hardening in the distant past, but there's been more investment recently. There's the government, in terms of funding for academia, those of us who are designing these systems to be more secure and more deployable, have now started to take into consideration the deployment. And the deployment itself means that the devices have to be able to be updatable. I think Lisa mentioned how hard that is. You have to be able to update them to be able to keep them secure. So there's a lot more investment in the science behind the engineering of real deployments. And agriculture is benefiting from these other industries, this healthcare and these internet, the smart cities. A lot of that, what we've learned there, can be brought to bear and then tailored to the needs of the agricultural settings, which is much harsher, much more difficult, and some new challenges. But I have hope that in the near term, in the next few years, we'll see much more resilient systems that we can deploy on farm, sensors and computer analysis that will fit together much better than in our past.
Most of our
Anybody else?
producers that I talked to, and again, it was a small sample, so it's certainly not generalizable in a large sense, trust that when they get a device, a new thing, a new drone, a new fill in that blank, that the company or the software to protect them is built in. And perhaps their assumption is wrong, but for better or worse, it is their assumption. We know what happens. However, they trust that when they put that password on their iPhone or their Android, or again, whatever they have, that's going to take care of them. Most of them do use passwords. They use password filters that are built into browsers, their phones and their devices. They don't look for other or added protections from what we found with our research.
A lot of vulnerability there. Okay. Next question comes from a graduate student at University of Windsor, Hossein Hassani, and he wants to ask Alireza how AI is used for food production optimization in digital agriculture. What are the most broadly used AI techniques for doing so? And I guess as part of the answer, you could also then talk about data vulnerabilities that would automatically arise as a result of using those techniques. So Alireza, you want to take that one?
So I already answered that in writing, and I think audience can see that. Do you want me to elaborate on that more?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know if everybody is watching the Q&A. Did you answer it in the Q&A?
Yes. So
Yeah.
there is another question in the Q&A that talks about how can we get farmers to start using precision ag technology in their farm. And I can talk a little bit about that. I think the government support would be very beneficial by introducing some incentive or tax break for farmers who adapt this technology, because after all, this is a benefit for everyone. If we start using precise management of crops and this technology, first of all, the growers, they can improve their yield and improve their productivity, reduce waste. And it's done while we are trying to protect the quality of the environment. So it's a win-win situation. And anyone who support this or wants to adapt that, I think we should support it with some kind of financial incentive or any other means that government can support an industry to change, to shift attitude towards a common practice that has been around for 30 years or more.
Thank you. Our next question comes from J.R. Colmenero, and I think it touches on something that Tiffany, you mentioned in passing, but I think maybe this is a good chance to talk about it in its full scope. What should be the role of state or federal governments in legislating data security practices regarding agriculture? Are there any current bills you would like to highlight?
Sure. Well, the other panelists may know of bills. I don't have any off the top of my head, and I did respond that in kind. State and federal government should probably be involved at the very least, just because we've seen in the very beginning of the pandemic what happened to our supply chains. And while we all made lots of jokes about toilet paper and other kinds of paper goods, those were very real examples. And so, the FBI, as I mentioned before, its whole division in cyber, but most folks don't make that their first phone call. If they suspect something, has gone wrong. They're not necessarily utilized well or have, as an agency, the person power to chase down every lead either. And so, yes, I think that the state and federal government should be involved in this, even in bills and things to protect. Again, we're seeing more bills that are now adapting to the times, talking about data, open access, right? Who owns what? But I think we can move a little bit faster and yet still be cautious to keep, our consumers and our citizens in mind as well.
Anybody else wants to address the role of state and federal government?
I'll just say that with this new infrastructure bill that was passed by Congress, a lot of the states have a lot of control over those funds, and a lot of those funds are being invested in rural communities to build their infrastructure. And I think we need to, be vocal that, security has to play a large role. I think a lot of people are thinking along these lines already, but this is a huge opportunity where there is money being invested right now that we can have influence over. And so I do think state and local is really important to have involved sort of at the infrastructure level. But it's really important also that farmers can feel confident that they have independence and can make decisions about their farms and control their data as well. So there needs to be kind of a public-private partnership, and I think it's going to happen with academia, where we can help give farmers some knobs, some control knobs over when their data leaves the farm. Where does it go? What happens to it? And maybe some tools like Alireza was talking about in the beginning about monitoring and making sure that that data doesn't leave the farm if it's not intended to be used by anybody else. So there's a lot of, it's complex, but it's a combination of players that need to be involved. But all the stakeholders need to kind of discuss how that best fits for an individual grower.
Thank you. Thank you. Our next question comes from Landon Klein, California Assembly Committee on Privacy and Consumer Protection. It's good to have him in this webinar. And he says, it seems that cybersecurity vulnerabilities in the agricultural supply chain will always arise from the weakest security link. That said, the supply chain is generally on a national or even international scale, and components of the supply chain outside of California cannot be regulated by California law. What are some best practices that we in California can encourage, either legislatively or otherwise, to incentivize components of the supply chain outside of California to adopt sufficient cybersecurity infrastructure? The conflict is a very interesting and important question. I wonder if any of our panelists have thoughts on how to do this.
Tiffany, do you want to start? You mentioned supply chain in the beginning. I can also speak to it, but maybe.
Go ahead. I'll follow you. No problem.
I was just going to say the key challenge is coordination and cooperation, because so many players, and they are individual vendors and parts of the industry, have an economic advantage to maintaining their piece of this big pipeline, which is our food supply. It's hard. There are barriers to sharing information. We see this in any type of complex system, but I think lawmakers and leaders have to find ways to both incentivize and ensure that there is information sharing that is sufficient to monitor the supply chain end to end. If we cannot see the data, we cannot know when things are going to go bad, or when there's potential for badness, or things are all working as they should most efficiently. We could gain benefit from insights that way as well. So I think we have a long way to go here, and I think it'd be good to discuss this further. This is a hard topic, and we need people at the table who are from this industry, who are academics thinking about this problem of data sharing and privacy control, and the lawmakers who can incentivize and encourage some of this behavior of free sharing, so that we can get some of these solutions in place soon.
Thanks, Chandra. I think we talked about this briefly. This is a system. This doesn't happen in a vacuum in just California. And I know we're speaking to mostly Californians, and so I do understand and respect that fundamentally. But I think even when we, pan out again a little bit bigger, when we think about this infrastructure as a system, again, the products hit California tables, they hit, Virginia tables, they hit all these tables when they go from farm to fork, but also understanding that much like the 4-H model, the corn clubs of the 60s and 70s, figuring out who will become those early adopters who then want to push policy, who are encouraging change of behavior. I'll be darned if someone can get my mom to put a password on, right? That's where I think we need to start, are those folks who said, yeah, we know we need it. And so, right, send it out to us. We may not like what you have to say, but we are listening, even if we're a little disgruntled over our morning coffee on our iPads. And so to answer that question as best I can, it's a system, and we need to be able to find those early adopters who will then diffuse that again out, like we did a long time ago when we sent little seed packets home with kids and they said, mommy, daddy, whoever, can we grow this? And it was new hybridized corn. And all of a sudden the parents who were resistant to it said, wow, this grows a lot better. The yield was phenomenal. Maybe we need to do that. And so without putting in really bad puns, setting those tiny seeds of early adopters, like folks on this call, the folks who've taken the time out of their day today, might be a good place to start. And so to answer Landon, maybe that's something you want to, get on your soapbox about and start seeing who also would like to be interested in that. And remembering it's a system, we're human, and humans, because we make a lot of mistakes, we also will ultimately cause our own, troubles as well once in a while without meaning to. We have good intentions. We just are our own worst enemy from time to time.
And I wanted to sort of
address, go ahead.
Sorry,
Lisa.
if I can, just a little bit around this. We need information sharing, and the concerns that some farmers have talked about we don't want to share with the government because they might use that against us. But I do think if we are going to, one of the things, if we're going to be able to encourage data sharing in some way, and do it kind of in a way that respects individual decisions, that starting to have conversations around data governance. Who actually owns the data generated somewhere? And it's one thing to say that, yes, this is what the terms of service to use this particular cloud platform are, but maybe those aren't optimal for us as an entire system. And that's, I think, the place where policymakers can start getting involved in saying, what do we want from the whole system, and how can we encourage that by getting people sitting down and saying, who does really own this, who gets to make the decisions about it, and how could that be done more effectively?
It struck me as I was listening to your answers and thinking about the question, that one industry that comes to mind is pharmaceutical industry, which also has complex supply chains. It's quite different from the agriculture, food and agriculture industry. So I'm not saying that solutions from pharmaceuticals can be applied to agriculture, but I think same issues arise there. And the fact that FDA is one agency that looks after both of these things, there might be opportunities for cross-fertilization of ideas and issues and solutions between the agriculture and food industry and pharmaceutical industry. There could be other industries too that bear some resemblance to the question that's being posed here, but it seems as if it's a really hard, complex, but important question. Ultimately, it affects what we eat on a daily basis. So what could be more important than that? Let's move on. Another question, any of our panelists can take this one. Are there specific crops that are more susceptible to data being disrupted or stolen? Do we have to worry about certain crops more than others? If so, which ones? Or are they all equally vulnerable?
Alireza, can you say a few words about this? You mentioned this earlier at the per plant level. I can also do some follow-up, or I can kick us off if you like.
I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
But
Chandra, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah. Okay, so I don't think it's really per crop basis that makes a crop more vulnerable or anything, or from another. But I do think that some crops just have more value. There are sets of high value crops where for a smaller piece of property, a lot more money is made. And so that's going to be a more appealing attack surface for people who want to get in and manipulate or take data or learn from or try to exploit an opportunity. Whereas somebody mentioned earlier, the really low margin crops, I think, are less vulnerable. But I also think another vulnerability we might want to think about is just these very, very large scale pieces of property, these very, thousands and thousands of acres. It's really hard to manage that physically in a security context. So as we start to instrument more and use more technology, we're going to have to think about, when we have these big spatial scales, how are we going to be able to control that data and its privacy and security?
I was thinking that maybe one way to get at the question that was just asked is to look at crops or areas where more of this digital agriculture is being implemented, because I think that's where the data is. I mean, right, so I would think that there is probably a way of getting at this question by just analyzing implementation of sensors, controls, data in different types of regions of the country and different crops. And I think that probably, and like you said, the value, right? I mean, people will go where the money is. And so I think maybe there is a way to get at that question, and perhaps a little bit more analysis and research could lead to some interesting insights on the question that I thought was really, really interesting. If there are no further thoughts on that question, we have another one, and this is for Alireza. Is precision agriculture adapted to specialty crops?
So precision agriculture, to my understanding, has three main components: sensing, interpretation, and application. And a specialty crop of California, unlike the row crops in the Midwest, are not heavily mechanized. There are not many machinery that can be modified to apply in a variable rate. And the only system that can be used for a specialty crop of California is the irrigation line that needs to be modified or changed with a new system that can apply on a zone-based instead of a uniform rate application, so that other nutrition can be also applied through the irrigation line with in a precision manner. Another problem compared to row crops of Midwest, which is again heavily mechanized and the precision ag is a very common practice, is that in California we are dealing with a lot of crop variability. So all this variability adds to the effort that is needed to develop data interpretation models that are crop specific or stress specific or specific to a particular location. So there is more work needs to be done for a specialty crop. There is more challenges for calibration and interpretation models that needs to provide accurate and precise data at the first and second step. And then we need to also adapt new infrastructure that can be used for applying zone-based or site-specific crop management.
We are getting close to the end of our time. So I'm going to ask one last question, but I think the panelists should speak. You should feel free to say something that you haven't had a chance to say so far. And I think this is a question that arises in all different implementations of digital technologies. Is there ongoing security vulnerability assessment to protect data from aging technology? Older devices that are out there working. So that's sort of the last question, but use this remaining minute or two to just say whatever you would like the audience to take away from our webinar.
So my flippant answer to your question is that's what hackers do for us.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they don't report the results the way we would like them to. I am not convinced that it is really happening or done well. Simply because we see in other spaces and other industries that a lot of times these successful breaches happen because of old technologies. And if we have the issue of not enough bandwidth to run updates on farms, then we're going to absolutely have those problems. The bonus, though, sometimes is if we don't have enough bandwidth for those farms all to be connected to each other, they're kind of little islands, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's protecting us a little bit, and we're going to have to be really careful once we start giving them the ability to connect together and build out the bigger system. So one of my last words, I love that we're talking about this. It's been really awesome to talk to all of these experts here and get these different viewpoints. And I'm really excited that we are having these talks and that work is being done and we will be able to address these problems.
Okay. Any last words to our audience from the panelists?
No, just thanks for listening and thanks for this. Let's continue this conversation. I agree with Lisa completely. It's really important. The investment in the research and the technology behind the systems that need to go on farms is happening, but it needs to be larger and greater and faster, and more people need to be involved. If anybody is interested in these types of advances, we need to find a way to get you involved, because these problems are really critical, not just to the United States, but to the world. And it's going to take all of us if we're going to make progress faster. So I encourage you all to get in touch and let's find a way to solve some of these really hard problems together. Thank you. Well,
panelists, you've been just absolutely wonderful. You've given fantastic answers to lots of different questions. We have come to the end of our time. I would like to thank each one of you for your time and insights. And I want to thank the audience for joining us. And I'm going to turn it back over to Brie.
Thank you, Pramod, and thank you, panelists, and thank you to everybody who joined us today. If you would like to watch this briefing again or have a colleague who was interested but couldn't make it today, it'll be posted on our website along with an informational one-pager and contact information for all the experts that you've heard from today. And if you can't get enough of CCST, you can join us again today at 1 p.m. Pacific time for a roundtable discussion that we're facilitating in partnership with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research on critical climate change research gaps in the realm of working lands, water, and biodiversity. This discussion will contribute to California's 5th climate change assessment. So if you'd like to join, we've put the registration link in the chat. Thank you, everybody, and have a lovely day.